Something unbelievable happened that morning in the Franklin County Courthouse. An event so wild, so explosive, it would become the talk of the town for years. Picture this: a courtroom packed to the brim, every seat taken, every eye glued to the front, the air buzzing with whispers and restless energy. It wasn't just another dull hearing about speeding tickets or petty fines. No, this was something far bigger, far juicier, a spectacle that promised to unravel in ways no one could predict. The tension was thick, almost suffocating, as the crowd waited for the main event. The arrival of Ethan Roland, an 18-year-old rich kid whose name alone sparked gasps and eye rolls across the community. Ethan wasn't your average teenager. Born into a world of luxury, with a mansion that sprawled across acres and a trust fund fatter than most people's life savings, he'd grown up believing rules were for other people. His life was a blur of fast cars, lavish parties, and a social media feed dripping with designer clothes and smug selfies. But his reckless streak had landed him in hot water before: speeding tickets, wild stunts, even a rumored hit-and-run that his family's money quietly buried. This time, though, he'd pushed too far, and the consequences were barreling toward him like a freight train. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation, because Ethan wasn't just facing any judge. He was facing Judge Henry Porter, a man whose name carried the weight of legend. Judge Porter was no ordinary figure. In his mid-50s, he towered over the courtroom with a presence that silenced chaos without a single raised word. His sharp eyes could cut through lies like a blade, and his calm, steady voice held the power to make even the boldest defendants squirm. Known as the Iron Fist of Franklin County, he'd spent decades behind the bench, earning respect as a judge who didn't bend for wealth, status, or charm. To him, justice wasn't a game, it was a sacred duty. That morning, as he stepped into the courtroom, the murmurs faded to a hush, the room bowing to his authority. He adjusted his glasses, settled into his chair, and opened the file before him, ready to face whatever storm Ethan Roland was about to unleash. Then the doors swung open, and there he was, Ethan Roland, strutting in like he owned the place. Late, of course, because punctuality was beneath him. Dressed in sneakers that cost a small fortune, jeans ripped by design, and a hoodie screaming wealth, he looked more like a rock star than a defendant. His lawyer trailed behind him, a nervous wreck in a crisp suit, clearly dreading what was coming. Ethan didn't care. He sauntered down the aisle, chewing gum with a loud pop, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. Halfway to his seat, he stopped, right in the middle of the room, waving his lawyer aside like a servant so he could toss his bag onto the bench. The crowd stared, mouths agape, as his entitlement filled the space like a toxic cloud. The room, usually a fortress of order, felt the ripple of his arrogance. Seasoned court watchers leaned forward, sensing the drama about to explode. Ethan glanced around, his bored expression saying it all. This was a waste of his precious time. When the bailiff called, "All rise," the room stood in unison except Ethan. He lingered, rolling his eyes with a dramatic huff before dragging himself to his feet. His body language screamed defiance, a neon sign flashing. "I don't belong here." Judge Porter watched it all, his face a mask of calm, though his eyes flickered with something unreadable. He didn't react, not yet. Instead, he began the proceedings, his voice steady as he listed the charges. Traffic violations piled high, topped with a reckless driving incident that had nearly cost a man his life. Ethan didn't flinch. He slumped back into his chair, arms crossed, his posture a billboard of disrespect. The charges rolled off him like water off a duck back. To him, this was just another annoyance, another mess his family's money would mop up. But the courtroom felt different. The air crackled with the promise of something bigger, something unforgettable. Judge Porter's silence wasn't weakness. It was a coiled spring ready to snap. Ethan, oblivious, toyed with his hair, smirked at nothing, and set the stage for a showdown that would leave everyone reeling. What was coming next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning. The courtroom hung on a knife's edge as Judge Henry Porter's voice cut through the silence, laying out Ethan Roland's charges with the precision of a surgeon. Each word landed like a stone, heavy with meaning, detailing a string of traffic violations that painted a picture of a teenager drunk on privilege. But the real bombshell was still to come, the reckless driving charge tied to a cyclist whose life had been turned upside down. Ethan, though, didn't care. He sat there, sprawled in his chair like a king on a throne, tapping his fingers against the table in a rhythm that echoed through the room. The sound was loud, deliberate, a slap in the face to the solemnity of the moment. His lawyer, a sweating mess beside him, leaned in with a frantic whisper, begging him to stop. Ethan didn't. He flicked his hand, brushing the man off like a pesky fly, his arrogance blazing brighter than ever. The crowd watched spellbound as the tension ratcheted up. Judge Porter, unruffled, asked Ethan a simple question, his name a formality to confirm identity. Ethan barely looked up. He was fiddling with his phone under the table, thumbs tapping out a text, his face twisted in boredom. After a beat too long, he muttered, "Yeah, that's me," his voice flat and careless, dripping with disdain. A ripple of shock rolled through the spectators. Whispers erupted, heads turned. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a middle finger to the entire system. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering over the keys, stunned by the audacity. Ethan's lawyer sank lower in his seat, hands covering his face as if he could hide from the disaster unfolding. Judge Porter's response was ice cold. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto Ethan like a hawk spotting prey. His voice stayed level, but it carried a warning sharp enough to slice through steel. He told Ethan that decorum mattered here, that this wasn't a playground for his tantrums. The room held its breath, waiting for Ethan to back down, to show a shred of humility. Instead, he smirked, a slow, lazy grin that spread across his face like oil on water. He twirled a strand of his messy blonde hair, leaning back further in his chair, and let out a sarcastic, "Sure thing, Your Honor." The words oozed mockery, each syllable a taunt. Gasps echoed from the gallery. A woman in the back clutched her purse tighter, her eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan's lawyer looked ready to bolt. But Judge Porter didn't flinch. His face remained a fortress, unshaken by the teenager's antics. He pressed on, asking Ethan if he understood the charges, serious accusations that could unravel his cushy life. Ethan's response was a masterclass in defiance. He rolled his eyes so hard it was a wonder they didn't fall out, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh that bounced off the walls. Then he spoke, his voice thick with contempt, claiming the charges were nothing, stupid tickets, a cyclist who overreacted, a waste of everyone's time. He waved his hand again, dismissing it all as if he were shooing away a beggar. The room went dead silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Even the air felt heavier, charged with the promise of a storm. Judge Porter closed the folder in front of him with a slow, deliberate motion, setting his glasses down with care. The gesture was small, but it screamed power, a quiet signal that something monumental was brewing. He looked at Ethan, his eyes piercing through the teenager's bravado, and warned him to watch his words. The tone wasn't loud, wasn't angry, it was worse. It was calm, controlled, the kind of calm that comes before a tsunami. The spectators leaned in, pulses racing, sensing the shift. Ethan, though, stayed blind to it. He shrugged, leaning forward now, his elbows on the table, and doubled down. He insisted he hadn't hurt anyone, that this whole thing was ridiculous, his voice rising just enough to show his irritation. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the judge to strike. What Ethan didn't see, what he couldn't see, was the trap he'd walked into. Judge Porter's silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Every smirk, every eye roll, every flippant word was fuel, piling up for a fire Ethan couldn't imagine. The judge sat back, hands folded, letting the teenager dig his own grave. The room pulsed with anticipation, the kind that makes your skin prickle. Ethan thought he was untouchable, a prince above the law, but he was about to learn that even princes can fall. The stage was set, the fuse lit, and what came next would sear itself into the memory of everyone watching. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, a vacuum sucking up every whisper, every rustle, as Judge Henry Porter stared down Ethan Roland. The teenager's last words, calling the case ridiculous, brushing off the charges like crumbs, hung in the air, a challenge no one could ignore. Judge Porter leaned back, his piercing gaze never wavering, his calm a stark contrast to the chaos Ethan had sown. The room felt like it was teetering on the edge of a cliff, every spectator frozen, waiting for the judge to respond. Ethan, still slouched in his chair, smirked faintly, oblivious to the weight crashing toward him. Judge Porter broke the silence, his voice steady, almost gentle but laced with an authority that made the walls tremble. He asked Ethan if he truly thought this was ridiculous, a simple question that landed like a thunderclap. Ethan scoffed, his arrogance unshaken, his shoulders lifting in a lazy shrug. He insisted it wasn't a big deal, that he hadn't robbed a bank or murdered anyone, that the whole thing was overblown. His hand waved dismissively again, a gesture so ingrained it was practically his signature. The crowd bristled, a few gasps slipping out, but Judge Porter stayed still, nodding slowly as if absorbing every ounce of Ethan's defiance. Then the judge shifted gears. He explained the charges with chilling clarity, stripping away Ethan's delusions one by one. This wasn't just about tickets or a joyride gone wrong. It was about a cyclist, a real person whose life Ethan had endangered. The law didn't care about his excuses. It cared about impact. Ethan rolled his eyes again, muttering something under his breath, his voice too low to catch but loud enough to show he wasn't listening. Judge Porter's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, a crack in his calm facade that hinted at the storm brewing beneath. He asked Ethan if he remembered the incident, the one that had dragged him here. Ethan's response was flippant, careless. A shrug, a bored look, a quick recounting of a cyclist swerving, him honking, and that being the end of it. He crossed his arms, leaning back, insisting no harm was done. The room tensed, the air growing thick with disbelief. Judge Porter didn't let it slide. He reached for a document, flipping through it with slow, deliberate care, then turned his attention to the courtroom. His voice rose slightly, commanding every ear as he revealed the truth Ethan had ignored. The cyclist, Diego Alvarez, wasn't just some random figure. He was a 45-year-old father of two, riding in a bike lane, doing his job as a delivery driver when Ethan's car roared toward him. Alvarez had swerved, crashed, injured his shoulder, and hadn't worked since. Ethan's smirk faded, just for a second, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He glanced at his lawyer, who whispered something, but Ethan brushed it off, muttering that he hadn't hit the guy, that he was fine. Judge Porter pressed harder, his voice still calm but now edged with steel, asking if that sounded like no harm to Ethan. The teenager leaned back, feigning boredom, though his fingers twitched nervously. He claimed people were dramatic, his tone weaker, less sure. The gallery stirred, a few sharp intakes of breath cutting through the silence. Judge Porter tapped his pen against the desk, a small sound that echoed like a gunshot, then dropped the bombshell. Diego Alvarez was there, in the courtroom, watching. Heads turned, eyes locking onto a man in the second row. Diego sat quietly, his arm in a sling, his face etched with exhaustion and a quiet sadness that hit harder than any shout. Ethan shifted, his bravado cracking, his gaze darting to Diego before snapping away. He mumbled that the guy was fine, but the words sounded hollow, desperate. Judge Porter didn't relent. He pointed out Ethan's dismissal of Diego's pain, his refusal to see the wreckage he'd left behind. This wasn't just about one man. It was about a society where privilege couldn't dodge accountability. The room was a pressure cooker now, every breath held, every heart pounding. Judge Porter sat back, his voice dropping to a tone so grave it felt like a verdict itself. He told Ethan that since he didn't care about consequences, he'd feel them firsthand. Ethan blinked, his mask slipping, a flicker of fear replacing his smirk. He asked what that meant, his voice shaky for the first time. Judge Porter didn't rush to answer. He signaled the bailiff, who handed him papers, and began reading Ethan's fate. Fines, community service, empathy training, each penalty a brick in a wall Ethan couldn't climb. But it was more than that. The judge wove a message into his ruling, a searing lecture on privilege, responsibility, and the cost of arrogance, delivered with a quiet fury that left the room stunned. Ethan's face paled, his hands gripping the table, the reality sinking in. The crowd erupted in hushed awe, some nodding, others wiping tears as Judge Porter's words reshaped the air. This wasn't just a sentence. It was a wake-up call, a moment that would echo beyond those walls, leaving Ethan and everyone speechless. The courtroom stood frozen in time, a cavern of shocked silence as Judge Henry Porter's gavel struck the bench with a sound that reverberated like thunder. Ethan Roland, the golden boy of privilege, sat motionless, his once cocky smirk erased as if it had never existed. His hazel eyes, usually glinting with defiance, now widened in a mixture of disbelief and dread, reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead. His hands, which moments ago had tapped a careless rhythm on the polished oak table, now clenched the edge so fiercely that his knuckles glowed white against his tanned skin. The fines, staggering sums that would drain even his trust fund, echoed in his mind. But it was the community service and empathy training that truly rattled him. Each word from the judge's mouth, a chisel chipping away at the fortress of entitlement he'd built around himself. Around him, the room buzzed with a strange energy, a collective holding of breath. The spectators, a patchwork of curious locals, reporters, and a few teary-eyed activists, sat riveted, their reactions painting a vivid tapestry. An older man in a faded jacket gripped the bench in front of him, his weathered face alight with something like hope. A young woman in the back row scribbled furiously in a notebook, her pen racing to capture every detail of this unprecedented moment. Even the bailiff, a stern figure who'd seen countless rulings, shifted his weight, his usual stoicism replaced by a flicker of astonishment. Judge Porter's voice, steady and resonant, had woven a spell over them all, transforming a routine hearing into a spectacle of justice that would be recounted for years. Ethan's lawyer, a wiry man in an expensive suit, slumped beside him, his defeat palpable. He'd spent hours prepping Ethan, warning him to show remorse, to at least pretend humility, but the teenager had laughed it off, certain his family's wealth would smooth over any trouble. Now, that confidence lay in ruins, and the lawyer's gaze dropped to the floor, already anticipating the storm of phone calls from Ethan's furious parents. The fines were steep, yes, but it was the judge's insistence on personal accountability, the community service, the training, that cut deepest. Ethan couldn't buy his way out of this. No check could erase the hours he'd have to spend facing the consequences of his actions. As the gavel's echo faded, Diego Alvarez stood, a solitary figure in the sea of seated onlookers. His arm rested in a sling, a silent testament to the crash Ethan had caused, and his face bore the lines of exhaustion and resilience. Yet his eyes held no malice, only a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room with an almost tangible weight. He didn't need to say a word. His presence spoke volumes, a living reminder of the human cost of Ethan's recklessness. Ethan's head jerked slightly, his gaze catching Diego's for a heartbeat, a collision of guilt and recognition. Before he tore his eyes away, his breath hitching as the first threads of shame began to unravel inside him. The bailiff moved forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floor, signaling the end of the hearing. Ethan rose on unsteady legs, his designer sneakers scuffing the wood as he was led toward the exit. The crowd erupted into a low hum, whispers weaving through the air like threads of a tapestry. Some shook their heads, marveling at the judge's audacity. Others nodded, their faces alight with approval. A woman in a floral dress clutched a crumpled tissue, her eyes glistening as she murmured to her neighbor about justice finally being served. Judge Porter, his work complete, gathered his papers with deliberate care, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the bench. As he turned to leave, a faint, knowing smile curved his lips, a rare crack in his granite facade, a sign that he, too, felt the weight of what he'd done. Outside, the world waited like a predator, hungry and relentless. The courthouse steps swarmed with reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm, their voices clamoring for a soundbite. Ethan's name would dominate headlines by nightfall, his smirking yearbook photo plastered across every screen, his story dissected by strangers who'd never met him. But beyond the media circus, a deeper reckoning loomed. The community service would thrust him into a world he'd never bothered to notice. The empathy training would force him to confront emotions he'd always dismissed. His bubble had burst, and the shards were sharp. The car ride home was a blur, the tinted windows shielding him from the chaos but not from his thoughts. His phone buzzed incessantly, texts from his father, no doubt laced with rage, demands for explanations Ethan didn't have. He ignored it, staring instead at his reflection in the glass, a ghostly image of a boy he barely recognized. The smirk was gone, the bravado extinguished, replaced by a hollow uncertainty that gnawed at him. For the first time, he wondered what came next, not just the punishment, but the person he'd become when it was over. The question lingered, heavy and unanswered, as the car sped through the city, carrying him toward a future he couldn't yet imagine. The community center loomed before Ethan like a relic from another era, its faded brick walls and chipped paint a stark contrast to the gleaming glass towers of his usual haunts. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood, burnt coffee, and the faint tang of cleaning supplies, a far cry from the lavender-scented lobbies he knew. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a cold, unforgiving glow on the scuffed linoleum and mismatched furniture. This was his punishment, his exile, the place where Judge Porter's ruling would strip away his comfort and force him to face a reality he'd spent his life avoiding. He stood in the doorway, his pristine hoodie and spotless sneakers absurdly out of place, his lip curling in a sneer he couldn't quite suppress. Ms. Green, the center's coordinator, greeted him with a look that could cut glass. She was a sturdy woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing, her presence a blend of authority and quiet compassion. She handed him a mop and a bucket, her instructions curt: clean the kitchen, top to bottom. Ethan took the tools with a dramatic sigh, his mind already plotting shortcuts. As he sloshed water across the grimy tiles, resentment simmered in his chest. His friends were probably jetting off to some exclusive retreat, sipping cocktails by an infinity pool, while he was here, reduced to a janitor in a place that reeked of desperation. The unfairness of it all fueled his every swipe of the mop, his movements sloppy and half-hearted. But the center had a way of creeping under his skin. It wasn't just a building, it was a heartbeat, pulsing with the lives of people who depended on it. Day after day, Ethan watched as families poured through the doors, parents with tired eyes and determined strides, kids with patched backpacks and boundless energy. The after-school programs buzzed with laughter, the job training sessions hummed with quiet hope. Volunteers moved through the chaos with a grace Ethan couldn't fathom, their hands quick to help, their smiles offered without expectation. He'd never seen anything like it, this raw, unpolished humanity, and it unsettled him, stirring something he couldn't name. One humid afternoon, as he stacked chairs with the enthusiasm of a sloth, Ethan's gaze landed on a boy about his age. Marcus, he'd later learn, was all elbows and knees, his clothes a size too big, his sneakers patched with silver tape. He sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a gaggle of younger kids, guiding them through a math worksheet with a patience that seemed endless. Ethan smirked, a reflex born of habit. Why waste time on something so pointless? But then Marcus looked up, his dark eyes meeting Ethan's, and smiled. It was a simple, unguarded grin, warm and disarming, and it hit Ethan like a punch. He turned away, heat creeping up his neck, his sneer faltering as an unfamiliar pang twisted in his gut. The empathy training sessions only deepened that unease. Held in a cramped room with peeling wallpaper, the circle of chairs held a motley crew, shoplifters, drunk drivers, people whose mistakes had landed them here. Dr. Owens, the facilitator, was a wiry man with a gentle voice and a knack for peeling back layers. Ethan scoffed at first, slouching in his seat as the group shared their stories. A woman with graying hair spoke of a car accident that cost her everything, her voice breaking as she described the wreckage. A burly man confessed to years of addiction, his fists clenched as he recounted the family he'd lost. Their words were jagged, real, and they lodged in Ethan's chest like splinters, refusing to be ignored. The turning point came during a session on accountability. Dr. Owens handed out paper and pens, instructing them to write a letter to someone they'd hurt. Ethan stared at the blank page, his mind a tangle of defiance and doubt. Who had he wronged? His parents, maybe, for the embarrassment he'd caused. His friends for drifting away. Diego Alvarez, the cyclist whose life he'd nearly destroyed. The thought of Diego brought a rush of nausea, his quiet dignity in the courtroom flashing before Ethan's eyes. His pen trembled as he wrote, the words pouring out in a chaotic scrawl. Regret, guilt, a plea for forgiveness he didn't deserve. He didn't know if he'd send it, but the act of writing it broke something open, a dam bursting with emotions he'd buried deep. By the end of his service, Ethan was a shadow of the boy who'd walked in. The center had worn him down, peeling back the layers of arrogance to reveal something raw and vulnerable. He'd scrubbed floors until his hands blistered, served meals to people who thanked him with shy smiles, even helped Marcus tutor the kids, his own patience surprising him. Marcus became a friend, sharing stories of a life shaped by struggle and dreams of teaching. Ethan listened, absorbing every word, and began to see the world through eyes not his own. It was humbling, a quiet revolution in his soul. On his last day, Ms. Green handed him an envelope, her expression softer than usual. Inside was a note from Diego, its careful handwriting a jolt to Ethan's system. I forgive you, not for you but for me. I hope you find your way. He stood in the parking lot, the paper crumpling in his fist, tears stinging his eyes. The weight of Diego's grace crashed over him, a gift he hadn't earned but couldn't refuse. For the first time, he felt the full scope of his actions, and the fragile, flickering hope of redemption. The Franklin County Courthouse stood like a monolith against the evening sky, its stone facade bathed in the golden glow of a setting sun. Ethan Roland paused at the base of the steps, his breath catching as he looked up at the building that had shattered his old life 6 months ago. Back then, he'd been a stranger to himself, brash, untouchable, a king in a kingdom of privilege. Now, as he climbed the steps, each one a quiet echo of his journey, he felt like a man reborn, though the scars of his transformation still ached. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves, and the world seemed to hold its breath as he crossed the threshold into the place where it all began. The courtroom was a shadow of its former chaos, the benches empty save for a lone janitor sweeping the floor, his broom whispering against the wood. Ethan's footsteps echoed in the stillness, a solitary rhythm as he approached the bench where Judge Porter had delivered his fate. He wasn't here for a hearing, not this time. He'd come to see the judge to offer thanks, to prove that the lessons had taken root. But the clerk at the desk shook her head. Judge Porter was in his chambers, busy with paperwork. Ethan asked to wait, sinking into a hard wooden seat, his hands clasped tightly as memories flooded back. He thought of the community center, its peeling walls and buzzing lights, a place that had humbled him in ways he'd never expected. He saw Ms. Green's stern face, her eyes softening as she watched him grow. He remembered Marcus, the boy with the duct-taped shoes, whose laughter and dreams had become a lifeline. He recalled the families, their resilience, their quiet strength, and the volunteers who gave without asking for anything in return. The empathy training flickered through his mind, too, the circle of broken souls whose stories had carved a space in his heart. And the letter to Diego, scrawled in a moment of raw honesty, a confession he'd carried like a stone until Diego's forgiveness set him free. Life after the center hadn't been easy. He'd returned home expecting to slide back into his old world, but it had shifted beneath him. His friends, once a tight-knit pack, had pulled away, unnerved by his quiet intensity, his refusal to mock the things he'd once dismissed. His parents, bewildered by the change, tried to bridge the gap with awkward questions and forced smiles, but they couldn't follow him into this new reality. Ethan didn't resent them. He was still figuring it out himself. The privilege he'd worn like armor now felt like a mantle, a call to act, to contribute rather than consume. It was a heavy burden, but one he was learning to carry. The chamber door creaked open and Judge Porter emerged, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. His gray eyes locked onto Ethan, narrowing slightly as recognition dawned. For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then the judge beckoned him into his chambers, a small space lined with books and faded photographs. Ethan hovered near the door, his throat tight as he searched for words. "Your Honor," he began, his voice rough, "I came to thank you." The judge's brow lifted, a silent question. "For waking me up," Ethan continued. "For showing me I wasn't untouchable, for giving me a chance to be better." Judge Porter settled into his chair, his gaze piercing. "Better is a choice, Mr. Roland," he said, his voice low and steady. "I gave you a push, but you took the steps. That's yours to own." Ethan shook his head, a faint smile breaking through. "You pointed me in the right direction," he said. "I was too blind to see it myself." The judge leaned back, his expression softening just enough to hint at approval. "Privilege is a double-edged sword," he mused. "Wield it wrong and it cuts you. Wield it right and it can build something worth keeping. What will you do with it now?" The question lingered as Ethan left the courthouse, the sky now streaked with twilight hues. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to Marcus's number. They'd grown close, and Ethan had spent hours helping him craft college applications, chasing a dream Marcus deserved. A text buzzed through. Marcus had gotten a scholarship, and Ethan's chest swelled with pride. But there was one more thread to tie, one more step to take. Diego Alvarez had moved forward, his shoulder healed, his life steady again. Ethan had heard he volunteered at the center now, teaching kids to ride bikes safely, turning his pain into purpose. The thought of facing him again sent a shiver through Ethan, but he knew it was time. The drive to the center was a quiet one, the streets bathed in dusk's gentle glow. Ethan found Diego in the back room, arranging chairs, his movements slow but sure. The older man looked up, surprise flickering across his face as Ethan stepped closer. Silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of their past. Ethan pulled the worn letter from his pocket, its edges frayed, and held it out. "I wrote this months ago," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know if I should give it to you, but you should have it." Diego took it, his fingers brushing the paper as he studied Ethan's face. After a long pause, Diego spoke, his voice soft but firm. "You don't need to keep apologizing," he said. "I saw you change, that's enough." Ethan's eyes burned, but he pressed on. "No, it's not," he said. "I need you to know I get it now, what I did, how it hurt you. I can't fix it, but I can promise to do better." Diego folded the letter, tucking it away, a small smile breaking through. "That's all we can ask of ourselves," he said. "You're finding your way, Ethan. Don't stop." As Ethan walked back to his car, Diego's words wrapped around him like a lifeline. The stars were emerging, pinpricks of light in the deepening night, and for the first time, Ethan didn't fear the dark. He wasn't finished. There were still lessons to learn, amends to make, but he was moving forward. The dawn would come, as it always did, and he'd be ready to meet it, a better man than he'd been before. If you enjoyed this story, check out another video with an even more amazing tale. There's always something exciting waiting for you on our channel. And don't forget, more wonderful stories are coming soon. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our upcoming adventures.